Due to their underlying mechanics, RPGs generally are not known for being soul-crushingly difficult. They do, of course, contain obstacles, but the general rule of thumb is that if you're stuck on a boss, you just need to embrace the grind, make some modifications to your party setup, and try again with your now beefed up characters. It sounds overly simplistic, but even games known for their punishing difficulty, like the Souls franchise, still follow the same principle. But that doesn't mean RPGs cannot be inherently challenging, as the genre has seen its fair share of diabolical, player-enraging, controller-breaking demigods that no matter how much you upgrade everything, still require a hefty dose of skill to defeat. And of course, Final Fantasy is no exception to this. Today, we are going to continue our quest to analyze the underlying principles of our beloved franchise, and that means we are going to be turning our rather granular microscope onto the fascinating concept of superbosses. Our previous video on the top 10 hardest superbosses was just the tip of the iceberg. There is so much more to break down and explore, and the best place to start is with an exploration of the concept itself. So what exactly is a superboss? Based on the name, the most basic definition would be that they are souped up bosses that are harder to beat than a standard boss. But that's a huge oversimplification. So let's dive into some of the other crucial elements that help form this particular trope within the context of the Final Fantasy franchise. The first of which is that superbosses are always optional. Defeating them is never a requirement for beating the game's main story. Based on this, the truest superbosses fall into the realm of endgame content. They may appear in the final dungeon itself, or they become available around that time, but the idea is that they are tackled when your characters are strong enough to defeat the game's final boss without too much difficulty. Which then brings us onto our third criteria, that superbosses are on par with or are generally much harder than every single mandatory boss in the game, including the final boss. This may be down to increased level-based statistics or troublesome movesets, but the fights themselves need a much more thought-out plan of action to ensure success. Such is their difficulty, it's often alluded through the game's lore that they are either from another world or from an ancient civilization, and perhaps because of this, there's often only a paltry reward offered for defeating them, and it's often just a record of defeat. Sometimes though, they do protect some of the rarest rewards in the game. But if that is the case, then these rewards just often trivialize the rest of the game because they are unnecessarily powerful. It means that with all of these elements combined, we have a clear indication of how superbosses fit into the wider landscape, but now it's time to see how they've been implemented within the Final Fantasy franchise, starting with the very first game. Because yes, superbosses are as old as the franchise itself, even if at the time they weren't dubbed as such. And that's all thanks to the addition of Warmech. This particular enemy acted as a rather harsh reality check for gamers who were slogging it through the high level dungeon towards the end of the game, preparing to take on one of the game's hardest mandatory bosses, Tiamat. And that's because not only was Warmech tougher than Tiamat, it also appeared as a very rare random encounter. Its appearance created a horrible scenario, where unprepared gamers approach the fight expecting it to be on par with other random encounters in that area, only to be rather surprised by its nuclear ability. Now, due to it being a random encounter, the developers decided that Warmech shouldn't guard any high-level items, but it did award a huge amount of experience if defeated, 32,000 to be precise, way more than Tiamat's paltry 5,496. What's rather curious about Warmech, outside of its difficulty, is that it's also incredibly out of place in terms of its design. Final Fantasy I was grounded in high fantasy, with elves and dwarves, lots of traditional magic and castles, yet here was an enemy that was essentially a hulking mech, and it suggested that Warmech is a relic of a long-lost civilization whose technology far surpassed the modern world, a characteristic that many of the future superbosses would also share. Within later re-releases of Final Fantasy I, Warmech was made even harder as a random encounter, but with the PSP's 20th anniversary edition, we also got to see a true superboss introduced to the game, Chronodia. As the franchise then moved forward, while many facets of the original were set aside, Warmech's legacy lived on thanks to the Iron Giant. You may recognise this hulking suit of armour from countless other appearances, but in its debut, the Iron Giant served a purpose similar to Warmech. It was a random encounter in the late game that had the potential to surprise and wreck unsuspecting gamers. Unlike Warmech, however, those who felled an Iron Giant were actually rewarded with good stat growth and the chance of getting some very valuable equipment like the Excalibur, every piece of the Genji armor, and the Aegis shield. With subsequent versions of the game, 2 new super bosses were added, Phrygios and its summoner, Dumion. The former was rather generic, but the latter added some compelling backstory to the world of Final Fantasy II, as it's implied that Dumion is from a long-lost era where everyone could use magic. He had been sealed away alongside the secret of Destroy Magic to protect it from being unleashed on the world. Following on from Warmech and Iron Giant, the developers decided that neither Final Fantasy III or IV should feature super bosses, but re-releases of these games rectified this. Within the 3D remake of Final Fantasy III, there was a new Iron Giant that became available after unlocking the Mognet side quest, and within Final Fantasy IV, numerous super bosses were added to try and challenge gamers who weren't satisfied with the base game. Within the Game Boy Advance and PSP versions, Zeromus EG and Brachiorados could be found within the Lunar Ruins, and within the 3D remake, they were replaced by Geryon and Proto-Babel, who can be fought within the game's New Game Plus mode. What's interesting is that while the 2D super bosses offered some valuable items for defeating them, the 3D bosses didn't, and instead were much more connected to the game's wider lore. Now, if we're speaking chronologically, by the time we arrived at Final Fantasy V, there had only been 2 super bosses featured within the franchise, but even though they had all of the hallmarks you'd expect from a super boss, it was Final Fantasy V that featured the first true super bosses, Shinryu and Omega. What separated these 2 super bosses out was that unlike Warmech and Iron Giant, they were no longer random encounters and now had physical locations. They were built for the sole purpose of challenging those who were brave enough to dare. Many a debate has raged about which one represents the greater challenge, and this was even reflected within the game's lore, which talks about the arrival of Omega and Shinryu, how they engaged in a lengthy battle, and how, with no victor in sight, they had to be sealed within the interdimensional rift, lest they destroy the entire world. And it's from here that it's been rumoured that they have been able to travel to other worlds. The interesting thing is that despite their apparent challenge, there is only an explicit reward for defeating Shinryu, the Ragnarok, although both do drop a key item that serves as proof of defeat, which should be considered reward enough. For the Game Boy Advanced edition, new endgame challenges were added, the first of which was stronger versions of the original 2 super bosses, Neo Shinryu and Omega Mark II. Once subdued, the party could then battle Enuo, the wizard alluded to throughout the story as the root of all of the world's problems. It meant that with Final Fantasy V, we had the quintessential implementation of the super boss trope. Ancient enemies with ties to other worlds, who despite being optional, are so strong they make the duel against the final boss seem very trivial. And for your troubles, you get only proof of victory and access to a rather powerful sword. Yet despite super bosses being so prevalent within Final Fantasy V, for the base implementations of Final Fantasy VI and VII, the developers chose to forego its implementation. Within Final Fantasy VI, a super boss called Kaiser Dragon or Tsar Dragon was planned, but it was dummied out, only to be added into the Game Boy Advance version along with Ultimate Weapon. You could make a case for Death Gaze being a super boss, but as it's fought over multiple encounters, its difficulty is significantly diminished. Likewise, Atma Weapon or Ultima Buster is also a tough fight, but it's very much overshadowed by the fight against Kefka. Within the Japanese release of Final Fantasy VII, it was a similar story. There were powerful enemies who acted as successors to Atma Weapon in Final Fantasy VI, but they weren't super boss material. That was until the release of Final Fantasy VII International. Utilizing the long localization time, the developers chose to make various tweaks ahead of the North American and European release of the game, and one of these tweaks was the addition of Emerald Weapon and Ruby Weapon. They were by far the hardest enemies found within the game and lurked in specific locations across Gaia. As was the case with the other weapons, they harkened back to a time of an ancient civilization, and in addition, they guarded rather unique rewards, the Earth Harp and Desert Rose, which allowed you to acquire Master Materia and a Gold Chocobo respectively. Perhaps realizing that gamers resonated with the challenge of Emerald and Ruby, the developers chose to have 2 new weapons return as Superbosses in Final Fantasy VIII. Ultima Weapon was the weaker of the two, acting as a straight reference to Final Fantasy VII, even carrying Cloud's Ultima Weapon, which could be acquired following the defeat of Ultima Weapon in that game. The real challenge though was Omega Weapon, who was hidden deep within Ultima Seer's castle. And as we saw in Final Fantasy V, such was the challenge of defeating Omega, proof of defeat was given as a reward after the battle. But unlike many previous Superbosses, there was no context given around their existence within the world. Nonetheless, both did fulfill the other criteria, and the lack of any real reward is perhaps the most brutal aspect of their appearance. Final Fantasy IX also featured a small but mighty selection of Superbosses, with the most famed being Ozma. This particular boss, which is rumoured to be otherworldly by many, was unique due to Final Fantasy IX's wider mechanics, and due to only having 55,535 HP, it harkened back to Shinryu and Omega, who only had 55,500 and 55,530 respectively. What was challenging about these fights was that their attack patterns were punishing, able to bring about defeat in an instant. Ozma stepped this up by featuring cunning AI that made picking the right move to outfox its advantages rather tricky. It meant the fight could be taxing, and in customary fashion, the reward for achieving victory was rather negligible, a pumice, which Dagger could use to learn her final Eidolon, Arc. The game's other super boss, Hades, also had many of the hallmarks. It can be fought right at the end of the game in Memoria, and based on the lore behind Memoria's creation, it's insinuated that Hades is from an ancient civilization. Hades is also particularly tough, but if Ozma has already been bested, the fight shouldn't be too troublesome. With the franchise moving on to the PlayStation 2, Superbosses had now become somewhat ingrained into the Final Fantasy experience, yet with Final Fantasy X, the developers chose to include them in a similar way to how they had been with Final Fantasy VII. With the base game of the Japanese and North American release, the end game began in a deceivingly simple manner. 2 optional bosses appeared called Ultima Weapon and Omega Weapon, and they were tough, but not to the extent where they could be considered Superbosses. Where the challenge truly began was with the Monster Arena, where the objective was to capture one of every monster in the game. It became a gauntlet of hunting down fierce new enemies, and the reward was that the man who ran the arena would create new, unique monsters once certain criteria were met. Many of these monsters were harder than anything else faced in the game. Indeed, one called Shinryu even appeared as a reskinned version of Evre, but the true manifestation of this concept was Nemesis, a reskinned, upgraded version of Omega Weapon. This was by far the strongest foe in the original Japanese and North American release, and it could only be fought once all the other original creations had been felled. Outside of the challenge Nemesis represented, every other box was also ticked. It can be only accessed right at the end of the game, and it was an optional fight. And due to how it manifests, it's also very much otherworldly, and upon vanquishing it, you get the Mark of Conquest, a useless item that can only be used for vanity. But as was the case in Final Fantasy VII, for the international version of Final Fantasy X, which also doubled up as the PAL release, a whole new wave of superbosses were added called the Dark Aeons. These appeared in certain locations around Spira at the end of the game, representing a significant challenge and acting as otherworldly representations of Yuna's beloved Aeons. And as has been the case with many other Superboss editions in subsequent re-releases, they were a mere precursor to the game's ultimate Superboss, Penance. What's interesting though is that via Yojimbo's Zanmato attack, the developers introduced a way to defeat all of these Superbosses immediately, meaning it was down to the player whether or not they wanted to be honest with how they tackled these Superbosses. Nonetheless, it meant Final Fantasy X, via its international version, had one of the most comprehensive Superboss setups we'd ever seen, and its sequel only expanded upon this, adding in rather punishing Superbosses like Angra Mainyu, Tremor, Paragon, and Major Numerous. And what's interesting is that many of these Superbosses were also connected to the game's wider lore. But while this all was rather extensive, as the franchise ventured into the realm of the MMORPG, things started to get rather more complicated due to the numerous updates and expansions that saw a constant shifting of the goalposts. In Final Fantasy XI's earlier days, higher notorious monsters were often infamously imbalanced, and this only heightened following the release of the game's first expansion, Rise of the Zealot. Along with a whole host of new content, this expansion added Kirin, who became available after defeating 4 other notorious monsters named after 4 symbols of Chinese mythology, not unlike the 4 Fiends, as we explored in our previous Evolutions video. And to give an idea of the game's power creep, this battle took an alliance of players at least 2 hours when it released, but can now be put down within a minute. Rise of the Zealot also introduced a dimension adjacent to Vana'diel called Dynamis. This introduced a fearsome superboss called the Dynamis Lord. It acted as an upgraded version of the game's main antagonist, and in its earlier days would need a coordinated team of over 40 people to bring it down. As the game progressed, this boss was then upgraded further to the Arch Dynamis Lord. Rhapsodies of Vana'diel, the game's final expansion, also revamped Dynamis and introduced Diversions, which housed the Disjointed within. These are evil doppelgangers of the Elvan, Galka, Taru, and Mithra. Perhaps the most infamous notorious monster came with the second expansion though, Chains of Promathia, and that was Absolute Virtue. It wasn't even discovered for 3 months after it was added into the game, nor was it legitimately beaten until 3 years after its release. And even when this happened, it became a hot topic within the community, as the developers had a very definite idea about how this boss was supposed to be defeated, and many of the methods that people used were nerfed as a result of not being correct. For much of the game's history, Absolute Virtue dictated the state of the entire game, as Square Enix rebalanced it largely to accommodate changes in player strategy for that one fight. However, beating Absolute Virtue became much more feasible though, following backlash around another boss that was added with the game's third expansion, Treasures of Artugan, called Pandemonium Warden. This boss was a huge step up compared to anything that came before, and as was discussed in our hardest Superbosses video, its inclusion attracted quite a lot of negative attention when a top tier Link shard attempted to defeat this boss for a solid 18 hours straight and was still unsuccessful. Its unique loot is still desirable in Final Fantasy XI's Twilight years, as it's useful for upgrading mythic weapons, and an upgraded version of this boss called the Tumult Curator is considered one of the toughest challenges present within the current version of the game. It meant Final Fantasy XI had a rather coloured history with Superbosses, as they stretched the concept even further in terms of difficulty, goading players who were glutton for punishment. Within the context of the game's lore, they were often otherworldly too, as noted by Kirin appearing in Tulia, which was built thousands of years prior to the events of the main game. They did, however, often offer decent rewards, which is contrary to the wider trope, but it makes sense given the MMO setting. For Final Fantasy XII, the concept of superbosses was reined back in and was much more akin to what we saw in Final Fantasy X, as it was connected to Clan Centurio, an elite group of monster hunters. Within the base game, these hunts became progressively harder until they ventured into Elite Mark territory, and the final mark was called Yiazmat. Now, depending on your competency with the Gambit system and your penchant for patience, there are debates about how difficult the fight against Yiazmat actually is, but it is still by far the most difficult encounter within the PlayStation 2 version of the game. Upon succeeding, you are granted one of the 3 components needed to unlock the Worm Hero Blade, a contender for being one of the best weapons in the original game. The other components came from finishing the fishing minigame and defeating another slightly easier super boss called Omega Mark 12, Ivalice's version of this recurring boss from Final Fantasy V. What's neat is that it's established through the bestiary and the clan information that Yiazmat and Omega Mark 12 are actually connected to Shinryu and Omega from Final Fantasy V. Based on the same description, it also alludes to Yiazmat being an ancient entity created by the creator himself. But with the release of the International Zodiac Job System and the Zodiac Age, the challenge of Yiazmat was significantly diminished, and a new fight took its place as being the most difficult. It would see you square off against all 5 Judge Magisters, as they appeared in the final level within the game's new trial mode. For Final Fantasy XIII, the developers decided to stick with the concept of hunting monsters, And to achieve this, they came up with a new side quest that revolved around the Seath Stones appearing all throughout Grand Pulse. There are 64 in total, and they pitted you against progressively more fearsome Seath, with the most fearsome of all being a superboss known as Vercingetorix. True to form, managing to defeat this rather tricky foe gave very little reward, but the questline connected with one of the essences of the superboss, as the Seath found throughout Grand Pulse are relics of a bygone era, a sea who failed their focus. Making progress within the Seath Stone quest also unlocked access to another superboss, the Longui. Oratois roam around Grand Pulse freely, and upon arrival they are composed of adamantoises and adamantortoises, but after completing Seath Stones 56 through to 62, Longui start to appear in their place. Within its sequel, 13.2, Longui also returned as superbosses, as did Vercingetorix, although it was now renamed as Yomi. But within the base game, Rasputil, a mighty Seath, represented the strongest foe, and it also paid tribute to earlier superbosses, as it was a rare random encounter. Within Lightning Returns, there were also two unique superbosses of note, Aeronite, which featured a whopping 57.75 million HP, and Erstigal, which could only be encountered on the extra day inside the Ultimate Layer. As the franchise then re-entered the realm of the MMORPG with Final Fantasy XIV, things started off much as they did with Final Fantasy XI, with very few superbosses. Within the original 1.0 version of the game, God rest its soul, they introduced a superboss who still continues to rear its head even now, Nail Deusdanus. And this superboss represented an interesting twist, as it was an enhanced version of the game's final main storyline boss, and the developers considered it at the time to be the most punishing battle available. From the Realm Reborn era onwards, the game has routinely added new and improved versions of bosses, raids and trials in a way more expansive manner than Final Fantasy XI. As of when this video is published, basically any level 70 raid or trial listed in the Duty Finder as Savage, Extreme or Ultimate could be considered strong enough to have foes within that constitute superbosses. This would include the Alphascape, Datascape and Sigmascape raids, and the trial, the Minstrel's Ballad, the Weapons Refrain Ultimate. And it's got to the point where there are so many superbosses that it's actually difficult to list them all. Perhaps the most noteworthy of these raids are those named for Bahamut. A Realm Reborn brought the Binding Coil of Bahamut, then the Second Coil, and the Final Coil. Later, Stormblood brought the Unending Coil of Bahamut, and within this, you are required to fight Twintania, Nail Deusdanus, and Bahamut Prime, which then becomes Golden Bahamut Prime. It's tough, and it's just one example of how much superbosses scaled out within Final Fantasy XIV. Of course, all this will no doubt change with the official launch of Shadowbringers, but for now, these are the highest hurdles in Final Fantasy XIV that players can try and clear. It is tough to fit an MMO into our mold, but by virtue of it being released after the main story of the current expansion, it's easy to consider many of these bosses as tougher than the final boss. And that brings us on to Final Fantasy XV, which, much like the MMOs did over the years, received several updates post-launch. And these updates have seen the highest challenges in the base game replaced by additions from later updates. What's more, as you could in Final Fantasy X with Yojimbo, you can also use the Ring of the Lucii to defeat many of these superbosses with ease. It may take a few attempts, but even the mighty Adamantoise superboss can be reduced to a singularity and banished to a different dimension with Noctis's Birthright. Nonetheless, it is worth noting some of the mightier superbosses outside of Adamantoise, like the Bilrost lurking at the bottom of Costlemark Tower. The grind to reach this fearsome serpent is half the challenge, but when you get there, it's still a tough fight. Two other superbosses exceeded the original level cap of 99 at the time of launch, the Ayakashi, a demon samurai, and the Naglfar, a creature of legend related to the Deathclaw. Another interesting superboss is the Max Angelus Zero, which like Warmech in the original Final Fantasy can appear as a random encounter. This time it's from Imperial dropships after Chapter 15. With later updates raising the player's level cap to 120, they also introduced timed hunts, which can only be fought on specific days of the month. The Dread Behemoth and Tyrannians were two examples of this. But if we're looking at the final incarnation of Final Fantasy XV, then there are two clear candidates for the hardest superbosses, one of which is Garuda. This particular super boss was introduced in a collaboration event with Final Fantasy XIV, and it's hard because it prohibits the use of the Ring of Lucii. Garuda can also eject people from the fight and is resistant to those Magitech exosuits. The other true super boss is Omega itself. Introduced into the game's lore via the Royal and Windows Edition as an ancient Magitech weapon from Solheim, the interdimensional traveller has ridiculous defences and can bypass the best defences available to the player. It acted as a nice tribute back to Final Fantasy V, although Shinryu was still notably absent from the game. It meant Final Fantasy XV, as we've seen with many of our other Evolution videos, had a very faithful representation of the trope we're discussing, with plenty of tributes even thrown in for good measure. Super bosses have also been present throughout many of the franchise's spin-off games, with the first major example being Elidibus from Final Fantasy Tactics, a legendary wizard from decades earlier. Within Tactics A2, Magic Weapon also appears as the ultimate challenge, and it's another iteration of the weapon concept that first appeared in Final Fantasy VI. It also acted as a successor to Omega, with scientists upgrading designs from Omega Mark XII. Final Fantasy Type 0 also featured two super bosses. The first was Gilgamesh, a well-known and recurring boss. The second was Nox Suzaku, who is much more challenging and is said to have mysterious origins, even threatening all of Orience. The Dissidia franchise also has super bosses housed within, thanks to an enhanced version of Chaos who appears at the end of the final storyline. But within Duodecim, the notion of the super boss was much clearer thanks to the addition of Feral Chaos. And then there's World of Final Fantasy, which, like Final Fantasy XV, had its super boss associated with another franchise. After venturing through the EX dungeons, you will eventually encounter XG, which acted as an homage to Xenogears. It means that although super bosses started off as a rather shy addition within the original Final Fantasy game, as the franchise developed, they have become a staple of the overall experience. What was once a brutal random encounter is now a permanent fixture, inspiring players to improve their skills and achieve what they previously thought that perhaps they could not. Unlike some of the other topics we've discussed though, the evolution of super bosses hasn't been all that pronounced, with the focus being more around the volume of super bosses that now appears within the games and the challenge they represent. There are definite themes, such as the association with hunts or marks, but the concept itself has stayed very consistent throughout, with the only major change being right at the start, where super bosses shifted from being random encounters to permanent fixtures. That doesn't make it any less fascinating though, and it's been great to dive into the various super bosses that have graced the franchise over the years, and uncovering how much those earlier instances really did influence what came after. Hopefully you enjoyed watching the video as much as we did researching it and pulling it all together, and I'd really like to extend a big thank you to Chris, aka Hugathy, for helping out a ton with this video. If there are any other specific motifs or tropes you would like us to explore in our next Evolutions video though, please head over to our Discord server where you can throw recommendations our way, or just put them in the comments below. Make sure you do let us know in the comments though which has been your favourite super boss over the years, and of course if you enjoyed this video please hit that like button and subscribe to our channel. Alright guys, this is Daryl signing out. A big thanks again to all our Patreon and YouTube membership supporters, and of course a big thank you to you all for watching this video. I'll see you again soon for more Final Fantasy goodness.